I reported from Fort Drum when the first U.S. troops returned from war in a long time. It was 2001. There was vicious fighting in Afghanistan, the U.S. response to 9/11. And talk started turning to PTSD and other issues those combat veterans might face. One officer who I spoke with at homecoming when troops returned said the Army has to get over the stigma of seeking help. More than 2 decades later, there are signs of progress on that front. A report finds more veterans are seeking medical and mental health counseling. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Morja Wealth Management, serving the North Country for 3 generations. MorjaWM.com. Securities offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower is an SEC-registered investment advisor.
Hey, I'm David Sommerstein. It's Tuesday, January 14th. First up, Governor Kathy Hochul put affordability and public safety front and center in her agenda for 2025 today. In a State of the State speech filled with personal anecdotes of growing up in a working-class family in Buffalo, Hochul said she identified with New Yorkers who are struggling.
Inflation, sky-high rents, wages that just don't feel like they can keep up, a changing economy, an influx of unexpected arrivals who had great needs. That's why I fight day in and day out to make New York healthier, cleaner, more affordable for you and your family.
The Democrat, in her first full term, laid out what she calls her affordability agenda. It includes a middle-class income tax cut, a so-called inflation rebate of up to $500, an expansion of the state child tax credit, and free school breakfast and lunch for all students.
As a mom, it pains me to think that little kids' stomachs are growling when they're sitting in school and they're supposed to be learning. In the wealthiest nation in the world, this can no longer be tolerated. Not in America, and definitely not in the great state of New York.
Hochul also called for steps to increase public safety, especially on New York City's subways. She wants a police officer on every overnight train, and she's pushing for the controversial policy of involuntary commitment, holding some mentally ill, unhoused people in treatment facilities against their will.
I know the phrase involuntary commitment reminds people of the prison-like institutions of the past. But that's not the objective of these proposals. We're in a different time now. As a result of our policies over the last 3 years, we've reshaped our mental health system with more doctors and more beds, more effective treatment options, and a more compassionate attitude toward care.
Hochul touched on other proposals, like making community college free for students pursuing in-demand careers such as healthcare and education. She defended passage of the Climate Change Superfund Act, which makes corporate polluters pay for the effects of climate change. And she wants to invest another $1 billion towards a zero-emissions economy. The North Country's Republican lawmakers were left with more questions than answers after the speech. Assemblyman Robert Smullen wasn't impressed, calling the governor's agenda the same empty promises. In a statement, State Senator Dan Steck of Queensbury said Hochul failed to provide a vision for ongoing issues at the northern border. One GOP senator from the North Country says he wants to see how she's going to pay for all this. Catherine Wheeler reports.
State Senator Mark Walczyk of Watertown says he saw quite the show during Governor Hochul's State of the State address on Tuesday, but he's left wanting more.
She mentioned a lot of very costly things, and a lot of programs, didn't mention anything that she was going to cut.
The governor outlined her agenda and proposed things like universal free school breakfast and lunch for students and a middle-class tax cut. Walczyk says he likes the idea of making things more affordable for New Yorkers, but he's not convinced on plans without seeing what the governor and Democrats are willing to cut to control spending.
The cost of government per person in New York is out of control. So we have to do something about spending. So it's great if you're talking about, putting money back in people's pockets, and that's what the governor said today. I'm certainly in support of that talking point, but there needs to be some real policy behind it.
Walczyk says he wants to work on affordability this session, too. He says he plans to focus on expanding access to internet and rural cell phone coverage and lowering the cost for both. He says a lot of the governor's plans will be more clear when the budget season begins next week. Catherine Wheeler, North Country Public Radio.
Military veterans in New York are twice as likely to report having a disability than they did 15 years ago. That's one of the findings in a recent report commissioned by the New York Health Foundation. Veterans have relatively high rates of physical and mental health issues, including PTSD and depression. But the report says the sharp increase in disabilities may be because veterans are reporting them more and seeking more help. Derek Coy is with the New York Health Foundation and also a veteran of the Marines. He says younger generations are overcoming the stigma of seeking counseling and other therapy.
So maybe they wouldn't have sought out a disability rating or VA compensation for a mental health issue. And then there's also something that we've seen as a result of the PACT Act, which was the largest expansion of veteran benefits, in a generation, maybe ever. And that what that does is expand benefits for veterans who were likely exposed to toxic chemicals. So we've seen a lot of things that have allowed veterans to I think, come forward and admit some of the issues they're having, but also make it easier for them to claim disability compensation.
Yeah, let's dive into, this shift in generational shift that you're talking about here. There being less of a stigma to seek, especially mental health care, but I'm sure health care of all kinds. How does that change, how we as a society can help these veterans get the care they need?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that, I always do or try to make a point to point out is that Vietnam veterans in particular have done so much to raise awareness about issues around mental health and the invisible wounds, what we consider the invisible wounds of war. And what we've seen is not only the reduction in stigma because of the generations prior to, but we've also seen a really unique veterans, especially in rural communities, which are very tight-knit, very, self-reliant, where you kind of know everyone and you have a similar culture. If one person comes up and says, hey, I've been having some mental health issues and I've been seeking care and I have a great service, that's going to, I think, really open up the doors to a lot of other folks that might not have felt comfortable coming forward for stigma, worried about maybe their job, if they're still in the military, maybe a security clearance, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of things that have changed, and now it's very common for folks even outside of the military community to admit, hey, I'm having some anxiety, I'm feeling depression, maybe I'm feeling things that I don't know and I want to talk to someone.
So the next obvious question is, are these veterans able to get the mental health and physical medical care that they're seeking?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And unfortunately, on the whole, not nearly as much as they should. And what we've seen is that we know that there's a provider shortage of just mental health care providers nationwide. It's really hard just to find one in general. Do they accept your insurance? Are they accepting new appointments? And on top of that, do they have any kind of military, cultural competency? Do they have an understanding of what some of the unique mental health needs of veterans are? And as we've seen, that's really not the case. We've seen the increased reliance on telemental health, which is actually great. It's able to provide services to rural communities, especially from VA, where folks might not have access, otherwise. But there's still a lot of issues with connectivity for internet, even just cell phone service. Do you have reliable, connection so that if you do have a mental health provider that you're seeing through telemental health services, is it secured? Is it, able to meet the needs that are required? And we're seeing a lot of those issues across the board, unfortunately.
Derek Coy is with the New York Health Foundation. If you're dealing with mental health issues or have contemplated suicide, call the National Crisis Hotline by dialing 988. It's available 24 hours a day. We have more news all the time at our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Christopher Watts of Canton and Jared Sommerfelt of Potsdam. I'm David Sommerstein, North Country Public Radio.